So here we see two images by Dante Gabriel Rossetti that connect to the poem of his sister, The Goblin Market. Goblin Market, I should say. Goblin Market and Other Poems by Christina Rossetti was published in 1862, as you can see on the title page here. It was completed by 1859. I'm highlighting Dante Gabriel Rossetti's images here again as a way to connect Christina's poem to some of the pre-Raphaelite ideas, um, and hopefully to provide a useful context for the poem itself. Briefly, as you know, if you've read the poem, we see in this verse a fairy tale like story of two sisters, Laura and Lizzie, who live in a fairy tale like forest and from time to time encounter these goblins who sell especially luscious fruit. The goblins constantly tempt the women to buy the fruit. Both women know that they should not eat the fruit. However, one day Laura is successfully tempted to eat the fruit by the goblins. She has to cut one lock of her blonde hair in return for the fruit. She eats the fruit voraciously, and over time she starts pining away, moving rather rapidly toward death. She's saved only when her sister Lizzie goes out to confront the goblins, and after she gives them a coin, they try to force the fruit upon her violently, but she keeps her mouth closed. Goes home to her sister Laura with the juices of the fruits on her flesh, and Laura licks her flesh very erotically, we might say, and she's restored to life. That's a basic summary. But I want us to note the image on the title page first. This is an image of the evening after Laura has given in to the temptations of the goblins and has eaten the fruit. She has said to her sister Lizzie, I plan to go back tomorrow to eat more of the fruit. It's so delicious. It's so wonderful. I need more of those juices. And we can see her dreaming in that circle to the left of her head of the goblins with huge bushels of fruit upon their heads. What I want to note, though, is the anatomies, let's say, of these two women. Notice that the woman to the right, which we can assume is Lizzie, is hugging her sister Laura in a protective fashion, already fearing that Laura might be in danger. But notice how traditionally masculine Lizzie looks. If you see other paintings in the Victorian period, in particular pre-Raphaelite paintings, women tend to be lean, waifish, thin. But Lizzie here has, again, when we are measuring her anatomy against traditions of the time, she has a fairly large muscular arm. Her neck is large and muscular, and her face looks like a man's face almost. Now, certainly, Laura looks a little more feminine in her face in this particular image, but if we look at the other image of her to the left here, this image showed up in the frontispiece of the poem. We see that she herself has that muscular quality that her sister has in the other image. Her arms are fairly big, her face looks masculine. So what is Dante Gabriel Rossetti trying to say? Well, regardless of what his sister might have meant, he clearly sees these women as strong. They're not passive, they're not victims, they're strong. And they're a bit androgynous, suggested that they're not bound by traditional gender differences. Indeed, they live alone without men, they take care of themselves just fine. So we wonder, what is it that drives Laura to eat of the fruit? Well, look at that image of her with the goblins. The goblins, of course, are basically human bodies with the heads of various animals: badgers, mice, owl. I think you can find a wombat in there if you want to. But notice that Lizzie meets them in the middle of the page, suggesting that she is just as strong as they are. She is leaning into her activity, cutting her hair. She's very active, as if she knows what she's doing, and she is deliberately partaking of sensual joy. And again, she's up to it. And she doesn't, it's not as if she's weak, waifish. If so, she might have been further to the left and the goblins would have been crowding upon her more. But she seems equal in strength and fortitude to the goblins, which suggests that certainly, even though she suffers from what she does in this moment, it's not as if she's necessarily doing something untoward. It might be that she's doing something normal, natural, healthy, strong. Notice the woman to the left corner, upper left corner. This can't be Lizzie, can it? We know that Lizzie has blonde hair. This woman has brown or black hair. We know that when Laura eats the fruit, Lizzie's nowhere around. And of course, there's no mention of another woman being around, especially a woman with a jug. So what does this tell us? What is Dante Gabriel trying to tell us about his interpretation of the poem? It seems as though this woman is carrying a very heavy jug. It's almost like she's looking back somewhat disdainfully at Laura. Here she is burdened, hunched over, whereas the young Laura is leaning heartily into this sensual pleasure. Is there bitterness? Is there resentment on the part of this woman in the upper left-hand corner? Maybe. Or do we see this woman in the upper left-hand corner as a symbol of virtue? She is walking away from the temptation that Laura is giving into. And of course, that's a burden. It's difficult to forego sensual temptation, but this woman does it. And maybe she's looking back not so much in resentment as looking back in disdain toward Laura, who's giving in. The point is that the image is ambiguous, as are both images. It's a poem both in the actual text, as we'll see tomorrow, and in these images that are based on Dante Gabriel's interpretation of the text. We see again that tension between the spiritual and the physical. The poem overtly is a spiritual allegory about the dangers of giving into physical temptation and the heroism of resisting physical temptation. But the way that the fruits are described, so luscious and delicious, we wonder why we want to forego those pleasures. And the way that these women are here depicted in these pictures suggests that there's a strength and a power to following what your body wants. So as we go through the poem, think about, again, this tension between the spiritual and the physical, but also this tension that we saw in Lady Lilith between what we might call the naturalist and the symbolic. Clearly this has a fairy tale quality, this story does. And therefore, much of the action is symbolic. Visible action points to a level of morality. But there is a very dense, sensual quality to the poem, the way the fruits are described, the way the goblins are described, dense physical textures that suggest that, yes, if these actions, if these things are symbolic, they're also just intrinsically meaningful for what they are. One doesn't need to look too far beyond the descriptions of the fruits or the animals to get to more abstract meanings. There's a power to the concreteness, in other words, of these passages, mainly concerning the fruits and the goblins. So what I've done here is I've tried to provide yet another context for thinking about the poem proper. I haven't gone very deeply into the poem on a textual level. What I've done is I've used Dante Gabriel's illustrations connected to the poem as lenses through which we can see parts of the poem. Tomorrow we'll just talk about how the text of the poem, how in some cases the text of the poem seems to reinforce Dante Gabriel's imagery, but also it might well push against Dante Gabriel's imagery, with Christina having her own sense of things and perhaps her brother having another.